Good morning and welcome. I would like to begin by thanking everybody for joining this roundtable discussion, especially so early on a Saturday morning. Heraclitus once said, in all seriousness, one of the major objectives of today's conference is to examine with fresh eyes what precisely happened in 1989 as the socialist regimes of Central and Eastern Europe unraveled with dramatic rapidity, and in the following years as they were replaced usually with democratic governments and market economies. What better way to kick off today than by asking some of our participants to relate their own personal experiences and memories of those events. But this event is also about taking stock of the dramatic changes that have swept over the region in the following 30 years, and of the commemoration of those events. Interpretations and perceptions of events naturally shift in relation to our distance from them. With that in mind, I have also invited our panel to share how their perspectives on these events have evolved in the intervening decades, to consider what details might have seemed important at the time, which now seem quite minuscule, or to note what they overlooked at the time, which later proved salient. So today, each panelist will briefly share some of their experiences and thoughts with us before I open the floor to what I hope will be a vibrant discussion. And I invite anybody in the audience who had similar experiences in 1989 to share them with us. Our first speaker today will be Maurizio Albahari. Dr. Albahari is an associate professor of anthropology here at the University of Notre Dame. Since completing his PhD at UC Irvine, his work has focused on the friction between power structures and human existence, particularly in the context of migration and refugee mobility. His recent book, Crimes of Peace, Mediterranean Migrations and the World's Deadliest Border, is a timely and close examination of migration between Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. State efforts to police borders and assert sovereignty in often vague situations, and non-state actors, both humanitarian and criminal. But today, he is here to talk about the arrival of Albanian migrants, which he witnessed while residing in southern Italy. Please join me in welcoming Maurizio Albahari.
Good morning. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. Thank you also for the invitation, the Institute. So, well, good morning and welcome. I am also saying, as Mark said, I am happy, glad that my last name worked in my favor, because it would be incredibly difficult to follow on any one of these speakers. So, I'm gonna actually cheat. I'm 1 year late, 1990, not 1989. Those 2 years, 1989 to 1991, for my work and my life, certainly, that's the end of history, but the accentuation of the contradictions of national sovereignty, human rights, and liberal democracy, that perhaps institutional and economic stability and the so-called Iron Curtain had somehow put on hold for less than half a century, perhaps. So not really the end of history, but the accentuation or the beginning of something else. I also want to premise this is going to be extremely informal, also because I was there in Notre, especially in anthropology, which is where I'm from, has been subjected to much scrutiny, maybe rightly so, also because sometimes it glosses over gender claims on authority and expertise. But I was there, I was already there. So I claim my authority. So in July 1990, so I was in my native southern Italy, and we were hosting the soccer World Cup. I'm sure no one cares about soccer in the room. I was really hoping we would win. We only made it to third place, which when you're hosting the World Cup is not a really good thing, but it was against England. We all have Brexit in the room. In the meantime, in Tirana, the capital of the People's Socialist Republic of Albania. So I'm not really sure, is it me being late? Is it the socialist government of Albania? But this is some 70 miles to the east of my hometown in Apulia, in the Apulia region. This is southeastern Italy across the Adriatic. And some 800 political dissidents are seeking refuge and asylum in the Italian embassy in Tirana. Thousands more are trespassing the gates of another 17 embassies, including France, West Germany, and newly post-communist Poland and Bulgaria. Quite incredibly, as as it might sound today, the Italian government organizes ferries, organized kind of corridors to Apulia across the Adriatic. And Albanian refugees are welcomed precisely as refugees. There is an Italian speaker in the room as profughi, which even carries a better connotation than refugee in English or rifugiati in Italian. These are welcomed as brothers beyond the sea, heroes of anti-communism, which the evil regime had kind of separated from us for 50 or so years. And what we see, what we do, what I witnessed and kind of participating as a teenager in coastal, local, regional, southern Italy is a mobilization, civic mobilization. It is coordinated often by diocese, by parishes, by individual priests, but also involves doctors, families, employers and volunteering, like offering jobs to newly arrived refugees. Again, quite incredibly, the media and journalists and everyone kind of is enthusiastic about the Albanian arrivals, and there is a practical, like a real sense of solidarity. Also, by the way, Southern Italians' gaze now, as of 1990, includes the East and the South, the rest of the Mediterranean, not only the North. We still do have in Italy this so-called Southern question, and as a Southerner, essentially until the day, so from 1975 formed to 1990, my gaze, my expectations, my aspirations had only been directed to the North. Now, like everyone else in Southern Italy, I realized there's actually something and somebody to our east, to our south. So, something about the Mediterranean position that will be much more relevant over the early 2000s and up until today. And as I kind of hinted, Albania, prior to this, had really not been part of local, regional, national, or maybe, the Western European imaginary, other than the side of oppression, backwardness under Hemoroja, the dictator who died in 1985. So, Albania was simply not there. It was not part of the equation. In reality, though, from my region, we did engage in, me personally, but tobacco smuggling between Albania and Italy with the collaboration of the Albanian authorities up until the 1990s. Fascism, Italians under fascism had invaded Albania, and they were there between 1939 and 1943. And fishermen, again, in this coastal region would kind of fish in front of the Albanian coast. So it's kind of this kind of isolation of Albania and southern Italy was kind of relatively new, historically speaking, or for historians in the room. Something that everyone remembers, everyone appreciated, is that the Albanians, when they arrived, they could speak Italian. They could speak Italian because of not, Italian being this international language, but to a degree because of radio and TV signals kind of actually arriving to Albania. And that fact, the awareness that everyone speaks Italian, maybe could have worked to kind of provincialize Italy, like to provincialize our own monolingualism or our presumption of being monolingual. Everyone speaks dialects, and Italy does have national minorities. So it kind of didn't. So it could have been a moment as, oh well, everyone speaks multiple languages. We're kind of stuck with our provincialism of monolingualism. Didn't quite happen. So this almost wrapping up. But this summer of 1990, which simplifying we can characterize with local, regional and even national solidarity was followed by summer of 1991. And already summer of 1991 was characterized by a much more centralized governmental approach, centered, with much authority with the police prefect, with the police, law and order approach, based on, okay, we need to track these people, we need to detain these people, and we need to deport these people, repatriate them. And the Rota is a cargo vessel, which in the book I cite as or name this sweet ship because it was carrying sugar from Cuba originally. But it kind of showed up in front of the Apulian coast, southern Italy, with 20,000 people on a single cargo vessel, 20,000 people from Albania. And those 20,000 people were, families, children, and everybody were detained in the stadium, soccer stadium, again, soccer comes back in office, of Bari, also in Apulia. And now the Albanians were seen as violent, as ungrateful beggars, as, people wearing rags. Anger or just statue, kind of powerful imagery there, had been brought down in February 1991. So that's why I said, not just 1989. So, again, simplifying a bit, but no more communism, plus the law and order detention approach. So no more communism, therefore no more refugees. Right? Albanians are something else now. So 1989, 1991, to wrap it up, once again, not an end, but the accentuation of the ongoing tension between 19th century ideologies of national sovereignty and the humanitarian, geopolitical, environmental, global challenges to that ideology, at least if sovereignty is incapable of reinventing or updating itself in light of these global challenges. And of course, I didn't come to this conclusion when I was 14. Hindsight. So thank you very much.
So I want to begin by thanking Bill and by thanking Mark. I hope it's okay if I say I've known my former student who's done incredible intellectual heavy lifting in this conference, and I want to thank Mel and all the members of the Nanovic staff because this is a tremendously difficult undertaking to bring everybody together. And it always looks easy from the outside, but it is not. So the latest issue of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies bulletin, a lot of you will know this institute, has an article called "The Fall of the Berlin Wall as a Moment of Joy." So I don't quite see it as that. Maybe it was in some respects, but what I remember about the immediate fall of the Berlin Wall is that it was a moment of surprise, confusion, and powerlessness. And here I'm particularly speaking about the elites because they are people I have some insight into. And I think that this focus, in addition to joy, let us give it that, is a key to understanding many of the trials that Germany faces today, as well as all of the members of the former Soviet bloc. We're going to have many presentations about the trials today and discussions about that. But I only want to look back to the surprise, confusion, and powerlessness of people who were in power. I had some unusual opportunities in the 1980s to spend a lot of time talking with officials, bureaucrats, some of the leaders of both Germanys. In the case of East Germany, my family and I, my family somewhat more reluctantly, but my family and I, in the spring of 1988, lived in East Berlin, and where I conducted scores of interviews, or began to conduct scores of interviews with members of the party elite. And Then without my family, the next time in the spring of 1989, I lived again in East Berlin. And then I'll add, because I'm going to end with this, in this period I also lived for extended periods in Bonn because I was interested in the attitudes of elites who were involved in the inter-German relationship, what at that time seemed only like the inter-German relationship, and of course would be transformed. And like everybody whom I met, both immediately before the fall of the wall and afterwards, I was surprised, confused, and it didn't matter in my case, but also powerless. But I would, to give you a sense of this period, I wouldn't simply start with what was happening in the period around the fall of the wall, but I think more importantly, the period of summer 1989, when things really began to fall apart and became manifested in August of that summer. And so I got this unusual opportunity, thanks to an organization that many of you know about and have benefited from, called IRX, to spend the time speaking with these officials. And I think this is the first Western political scientist. And so I'm only going to share some quick reflections about 3 of them, and then I'm going to say one thing about a West German participant directly around this time. The great thing about this opportunity to talk about I was there is I finally got around to going back to all of my interviews, and I found some of them that are relevant to my presentation today. So, but first of all, to capture the mood of the time, late morning, October 31st, I had the opportunity to meet with Günter Schabowski, who was a member of the Politburo of the SED, who would inadvertently, unknowingly, and kind of stupidly open the wall on 9 days later. 2 days earlier, I had seen Schabowski speak at the Rotes Rathaus, which is the city hall then, East Berlin, with an unlikely combination of various citizens groups, especially Neues Forum, which was really taking the lead in organizing the new opponents of the regime. And in the speech, I quickly concluded that Schabowski was a horse's ass, just really a very pompous guy. It turned out I was right, because that morning of October 31st, when I met with him, he had a manner of speaking about the events around him that was quite haughty and superior and full of pretenses. I'm sure there was no word for this, but blowhardism. And and then magically, about halfway through the interview, somebody I knew pretty well, Dick Barclay, who was ambassador to East Germany, just sort of appeared. And I'll get to him in a minute. But the main emphasis of our discussion with Schabowski was that he kind of wanted to present himself as an East German Gorbachev, and that he and his friends were going to put everything together. And Schabowski said, we have to pursue hard questions now about things like conducting elections, about term limits, and of course about the economy. Then he added, but of course, there is no need for structural change. Rather, the Politburo, in its enlightenment, should now be should open itself more to, quote, open to providing the population with opportunities for democratic expression of views. So kind of a glasnost that was too late in coming and could never have come. The biggest problem, he said, was that people aren't speaking together. The Neues Forum might contribute to this discussion, but he added, "We do not want it to be a party," end quote. Showing just how strange the situation was, Schabowski then praised the developments in the GDR, and I think this applied to Honecker too, that had led to the strengthening of the character of the General Secretary, and so this would apply to Hayden Krantz, who succeeded Honecker, whom Schabowski praised. And then confirming my impression of Schabowski as a jerk, at the end of the interview, aside from continually calling me the professor from Johns Hopkins, where I was not teaching, he said, "As you can see, Professor, I hardly let you say anything," which was true. And then, but interestingly, on the way out, Dick and I were going down the stairs of the Central Committee headquarters. On the way out, the assistant kind of grabbed, we were on either side, he grabbed both of us by the shoulders. And he said, the problem with Schabowski is that he always wants to appear as somebody who supports both left and right. In other words, nice positions on both sides. And then he looked at us and he said, "And these guys have no clue what is going on." On the morning of, maybe Schabowski was, well, I might have let me just check something about dates here. Oh, Schabowski was October 30th, so that's a typo. On the morning of October 31st, I met with a guy whom no one will have heard of, named Hans Schindler, who was the expert on the inter-German relationship in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the GDR's attitude about, the official attitude about West Germany was that it was another country. So they didn't see it as any kind of special relationship. They saw it as simply relations with another country. And I had met with Schindler in either May or June before, and he was still intoning the same theme, that they had been betrayed by the Soviet Union, particularly by Gorbachev, because the Soviets had acted as though, they were acting as though it was entirely up to the GDR to solve its problems. In my other meeting, my earlier meeting, Schindler was particularly angry with Gorbachev because Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, had given a speech in Paris in which he said something like, "The Berlin Wall, we don't know about the Berlin Wall, we didn't build the Berlin Wall, the East Germans built the wall, it's their responsibility." Now, by this time for Schindler, this was a cause for even more outrage. However, also uncertainty, because you couldn't know, even at that late date, that the Soviet Union wasn't going to invade. After all, there were still people up to November 9th in the military in the East Germany and in the Soviet Union who did talk about intervention. And this was a serious issue, but people just didn't know. So much for Schindler, and I haven't found my notes for him yet, but they're somewhere in a box someplace. So that evening of October 31st, I had a somewhat and wonderfully kind of Jean Le Carré-ish meeting in a dark room in a publishing house with Marcus Wolf. Some of you will know about him. He was the former head at that time of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Ministry of State Security. And long meeting, we talked about everything from his time with Wolfgang Leonhardt in the Comintern School, then founding of East Germany, which he arrived, he was an extremely young man, of current events. So, and as to my points about the block ladder, what I remember about Wolf, who looked a lot like Paul Newman, really very sophisticated, sophisticated guy, because the Stasi people in intelligence traveled a lot, and in Wolf's case, he had some interesting experiences. So I remember him talking about the danger that this will come to bloodshed. At that time was expired, we'll do this quickly. And Socialist, said, most people don't understand that the decision to use force can be made within minutes. This will be not quite fascist, but certainly dangerous. There is a genuine pressure in our country towards Stalinism. We've allowed holes to open up in our society that must now be closed, but how? And then he talked about the important thing was to reform socialism, but how could you do it without it disappearing? Then finally, I had a meeting on December 1st with a guy named Duisberg, who was a full senior advisor in the Foreign Office. This was at Ditchley, a place some of you know in England. And Duisberg had authored a 10-point plan for, quote, overcoming the division of Germany and Europe that had been released 3 days earlier. What's notable about the plan is that 9 of the 10 points were all about cooperation with East Germany and European dialogue, and only point 10 was about unification, but it was a very distant goal. And this was criticized for various reasons. So, uncertainty, surprise, helplessness.
Thank you, Jim. Now we will hear from Martin Kagel. Dr. Kagel is the A.G. Steer Professor in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies at the University of Georgia and the Associate Dean for Humanities and International Studies in Franklin College of Arts and Sciences there. His work focuses on modern German literature and culture, and especially on transnational literary history. Today, he will relate his experiences also in Berlin at the time. Please join me in welcoming Martin Kagel.
Thank you. I also want to begin by thanking my friend Bill Donahue and Mark Hitler and Mel and everybody else from the Nanovic staff for making this event possible. I welcome the broadened scope, that it's not just German navel-gazing. I think it's an opportune time to have this event, because I think in Germany itself there's more a reflective mood right now about what happened in 1989, more so than perhaps 10 years ago or at the 25th anniversary. So it's a great occasion, and I look forward to the time that we'll spend together sharing ideas about both Germany and then Eastern Europe as well. I also want to say that to Maurizio that I still have nightmares about the goal Italy scored in 2006 in the semifinals against Germany. So it's very present in my mind. And I want to thank James for the really terrific remarks. I'll give more of a bottom-up perspective because I was a student at the time in West Berlin. But I think everything he said I would endorse. It was my experience as well, also from hindsight. And I think there was a lot more ambivalence, both on the East German and the West German side at the time already visible, than was admitted then and perhaps later as well. So to give you a little bit of context, so I was a student at the Free University in West Berlin at the time. I had began studying there in 1984. I had grown up in Northwest Germany, you know, close to the Netherlands, far away from Eastern Europe. And I didn't have any relatives in Eastern Europe or in East Germany, so the division of Germany was just a fact for me when I was growing up. I didn't think very much about it. My orientation was towards Western Europe, where I, you know, would travel and spend time vacationing and so on and so forth. Important for me was also, as a youth, kind of the formative period I grew up in was the so-called German Autumn, which was the government's crackdown on terrorist activity and so-called sympathizers. We had a youth club where I spent a significant amount of time, and police would come often and search, do raids at the club, trying to intimidate people, frankly. It was also the time of kind of the peace movement in West Germany, where I was an active participant. My hair was a lot longer than it is now. And so when we crossed borders, or, you know, when we just drove to a different location. We would be stopped frequently, and I just, also searched. So there was kind of the atmosphere in West Germany was maybe less one of total freedom or liberty of movement and everything, even though all of these things existed. But in the mind of young people, the government played a fairly negative role for us growing up. So in Berlin, I was studying both German literature and theater, and actually I wanted to have a career in theater originally. So I spent a lot of time going to East Berlin, which was possible at the time and uncomplicated. I would go as often as once a week to see shows in East Berlin's theater, which was a leading theater in Germany, especially the Deutsche Theater in the Schumannstraße. And we all adored or admired Heiner Müller, of course, who also came frequently to West Berlin. We admired the work of Alexander Lang at the Deutsche Theater. The Gorki Theater was also a relevant theater where we spent time. So for me, I had both Berlins available in a certain way, even though it was a day visa and you had to return by midnight. But for me, the border was permeable, and that's the point I would like to make, that there was an experience on the other side. My then girlfriend also had relatives in Berlin-Buch, which is on the outside of East Berlin, so we spent time with them. So I had, kind of what I would consider more or less normal contact with East Germany and East Germans. On November 9, I was sick, actually. I was in bed, and I watched Günter Schabowski's famous announcement on television at the time, which, as you remember, was very veiled. He didn't say the border is open, but he said that you didn't need a visa to cross over to West Germany. And then he was asked, well, when will this go into effect? And he was winging it, I guess. And I said, well, I guess now. And that was around 7 p.m. in the evening. So I got some phone calls, at 9, 10 from friends who then just called and said, look, I just went over the border. That night I stayed home, but the next day I also went. The border crossing that was closest to us was in Badinenstraße, so I went there. I kind of took in the jubilant atmosphere. I recall that it was raining, and I felt a bit odd because even though I wanted to share in the joy, I think I felt that it wasn't my revolution in a certain way. It wasn't my joy necessarily, because I hadn't been the one who was liberated or freed. And I also, thought, as I said in my introductory remarks, that coming to the West was not was not an opening towards an unqualified form of freedom and excitement. I talked to friends also at the time who said that you live close to the Kurfürstendamm, which is like the main boulevard in West Berlin. And those friends said that many East Germans came there, but they kind of walked silently across the Kurfürstendamm. And this friend of mine he was from Greece, and he thought, what's wrong with these people? Or he was very irritated by it, and you wonder, why was that? I mean, there was a display of wealth, obviously, that was perhaps shocking for East Germans, but there may have been other reasons as well. I moved to East Germany or East Berlin in January 1990. So my then girlfriend and I decided that we were interested in kind of living through this period on the other side. And so we moved to Schönhauser Allee in Prenzlauer Berg. And I think that was probably the most interesting time for me and what I remember most vividly of the period. It was, in a way, a time of lawlessness, which was both fascinating and intimidating in some way. The area around the Schönhaus Allee looked a little bit like a war zone. I mean, there were a lot of burnt-out cars. There was a lot of stuff that was thrown away. So there were huge containers everywhere, and people, trashed their possessions, like material possessions, like TVs, fridges, and things like that, because now they wanted to buy new ones. There was also an openness that I think I've never experienced again since then, because there was a lot of discussion. I mean, the Neues Forum was very present. People tried to imagine the future in an open way because it wasn't quite clear what would happen, even though from hindsight, maybe perhaps we would say, well, it was totally clear what was going to happen, that, West Germany, the 4+2 agreement would happen, and East Germany would be integrated into kind of Western Germany. But at the time, looking forward, that was not the case. And it was a little bit like, I remember the period during the French Revolution. There's a revolutionary period right after the system breaks down, where people experience kind of an openness that they otherwise don't have in their political imagination. And I thought that was a very fascinating time for me to experience that. I went to a lot of events, I talked to a lot of different people. We debated many third ways that would have been or not have been possible. So that was a transformative experience, really. Maybe, I'm running out of time, so I'll offer some general reflections. I think, the film yesterday showed kind of the incommensurability of the banal personal experience at these huge historical events. And I think in some ways, it's also something that I experienced. I mean, my life, I was working on my master's thesis, I wanted to get on with my life, and yet all these things were happening, and they weren't really happening to me, yet they were happening to me because I was living in this place. And it's very difficult to negotiate that, and I think that's something that speaks to the disorientation, to the surprise and confusion, because it's difficult to match these large historical movements with the personal life of people who are experiencing that. So I think that was important. That was a message that I got from the film yesterday, and certainly something that makes things more complicated and less straightforward. So when Ronald Reagan came and said, Mr. Gorbachev, take down this wall, it wasn't like that at all. It wasn't an event that was low in complexity or ambivalence. The second thing I say in closure is something that I think we're facing now and is very important, which is that our identities were questioned or shattered. And I think there was an interesting article by Kathleen Benhold in the New York Times yesterday about this, about the uncertainty about all Germans as to their identity, both, East Germans, Germans with migrant background, West Germans. And I think, that the event, the fall of the wall, brought that about in many ways. And it's a question that remains unresolved for those who participated or were witnesses to this event, because I think Germany hasn't been successful, like the reunified Germany, in this redefinition of what its identity is. And it's part of, it's kind of refracted nationalism at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kagel. Our final speaker this morning is Tomasz Stepniewski. Dr. Stepniewski is an associate professor at the Institute of Political Science and International Relations and chair of the Department of Eastern Studies at the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin. His current research focuses on EU policies towards post-Soviet states, with particular interest in Ukraine, Georgia, and other states strongly influenced or partly occupied by Russia or its proxy forces. Today, he will discuss his experiences as an adolescent in Poland, watching as the socialist government crumbled in 1989. Please join me in welcoming Tomasz Stepniewski.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Bill, Mark, and Melanie, and the Nanovic Institute for being here. And I was there, I was 10 years old, so it's really difficult to say something from that time perspective, but because it was about geopolitical situation and how the situation has changed. But based on my conversations with my family, with my parents, and what has happened, so I can say that on the one hand, there is a kind of hope associated with Solidarność, solidarity movement. So and looking for something new as a kind of fresh situation. And of course, this hope was associated not only with Solidarność, but especially with Lech Wałęsa as a leader of this kind of group. But on the other hand, there is a kind of chaos and lack of predictability of the situation. What's going on in the region, not only in Poland, but in general in the region, and what about the job? What about the situation connected with workplaces, and what about the economy and so on? So this kind of chaotic situation. And when we are trying to understand the current situation, for example, in Poland, so we should remember that in 90s till 2004, there is a kind of transformation period. In 90s, mostly the situation was mostly focused on transformation of our economy, and then march towards NATO and the European Union, and that was the main goal. And after 2004, when we succeeded, when Poland became a member of the European Union, the situation has changed, because in 2004 Poland became a member of the European Union, and it was a different European Union than it is now. So it's really important to understand current situation. And 2015 there is also kind of turning point, because Law and Justice Party came to power, but also it is a kind of result of the situation of 1989, because when we are talking about the perception of this transformation point, so we should remember that from the society perspective, this turning point is perceived differently by society. For, let's say, half of the society, it was a kind of these changes were too fast and too deep, and a lot of people lose their jobs, and they lose their hopes, and so on. And the social costs were too high for the half of the society, let's say. But on the other hand, yeah, we have another half of the society who is succeeded, happy with the current situation, that we are a member of the European Union, so that we return to Europe, let's say. So it means that it was a kind of successful process. And what's really important to understand the current political situation, that both ruling parties, Law and Justice and Civic Platform, Platforma Obywatelska, they have the same roots. They belong to the same camp. Solidarność, solidarity movement. So in 90s, there were people, the politicians from both parties, they were working together. And right now we have this kind of strange situation. They fight each other. Yeah, but to be honest, they belong to the same camp in 90s. And when we are talking about values and so on, about democracy, democratic values, so these both parties, grew up from the solidarity movement. And to finally, so I can say that 1989 is still perceived differently by society, but also by politicians who make it as a tool in political struggle. And that's the main problem, because right now we have a huge debate about the consequences of 1989 right now. And this, as I mentioned, this quarrel between these two main parties is about the consequences, what happened 30 years later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tomek. I think now we'd like to open it up to general discussion. I don't think we have a microphone that we're passing around.
Yeah, we can use.
There's a general mic right there, we can speak loudly.
Okay, great. So I see a question back here from Grzegorz.
In the spring of '89, Harvard University and the Center for European Studies organized a conference on East Germany. So anybody who was somebody in the field of East German studies, Jim was there, came to Cambridge, and discussion lasted for 3 days. And after 3 days, the main conclusion which emerged from the whole conference was that Germany is a very much separate state. Mm-hmm. It has its own identity, it has its own sense of place in the world. There is no way in foreseeable future that German unification of any kind can take place. Now, my question to you is, how surprising was the fall of the wall? Did you feel that something impossible happened? Because now it's very easy to construct the narrative. Okay, all the structural forces were in place and inevitable happened. But was it something which you took as a very improbable event, and then was that a rationalization on your part after that this was sort of an moment in history?
Well, I can quickly respond to that. On November 9th, I received a call from Peter Schneider, a friend of mine, not German novelist, and who had written a book called The Bauerschweine, about people that jumped over the wall. And Peter said, what are we to make of this? What's going on? And he knew a lot about the wall. Certainly, I've never rationalized the past. I actually don't think it was predictable, and have reasons for that. But I was very shocked. I was one of the people who, up until that point, thought there was no way Germany would be reunified. And that included a lot of people in the German government. It included, I conducted about 80 interviews in 87, 88 in West Germany, and certainly nobody said we're going to be reunified, quite to the contrary. So the element of surprise was huge, and it's important for understanding history. I will also add this, to say that ordinary East Germans became enthusiastic about reunification is not to say that they didn't perceive themselves as part of a separate entity up until the fall of 1989. In fact, even after the wall, because they did perceive themselves as having a different identity, because that's the only identity they could imagine.
My question is elicited from Martin's comments, but it could be for any of you or anyone in the room. I was fascinated by your comments about the sense of openness that occurred in that interim period. And I think it was appealing not only for the ideas of what a third way might be, but simply because it was no longer what existed, and which was not like, and not yet anything specific. Once you choose or form something, there is a limit. Maurizio has a beautiful word for this, Möglichkeitssinn, a sense of possibilities. And as we look back, there won't be many who say it's now a great success in the East, and there won't be many who view with anything other than a certain cynicism, the nostalgie for the past. And so my question is, were there any intellectual ideas during this interim period about a third way that of course were not realized, but moments that could be, in a sense, integrated for the puzzle we have today?
Well, maybe I'll say a couple of words about the previous comment, and then
Yeah, sure.
I come to you. So one thing, because it's related, I mean, I think one thing that is very important is to recognize the role East Germany played in the West German imagination. And I think that also contributed to this kind of fossilized acceptance of the German division. So the Deutsche Frage, the German question, which was the question of reunification, came up very frequently in the 80s, but always in the context, this is never going to happen. But it was kind of perennially brought up, just to say, oh, well, it won't happen, But of course, for the West German left, East Germany did present on some level, and obviously in the 80s it was different, let's say, than in the 60s, an alternative, just a way of thinking in alternatives, I would say. I think as kind of naive, young people, we held up East Germany as a more humane society to our parents, and in a more sophisticated way. German writers or intellectuals did the same thing, essentially. So with that being gone, I think it disrupted not just the life of East Germans, but also this kind of political imagination of the German left. So into this space, for me personally, actually, it was Gregor Gysi who came into this space, because he was one of the first people who gave lectures and came to West Berlin, and who seemed to propose things that no German party did at the time. I mean, and he wasn't seen very critically initially. All the criticism that came later, the BDS hadn't been formed or anything. I remember an event at the TU Berlin, which must have been late in November or early December, where he spoke to about 2,000 students and kind of laid out things that we all thought, oh, well, yeah, this is what we want about the environment, about basic democracy, about critical approaches to capitalism, which at least in West Germany, West Berlin, we welcome very much. And I think our problem was, or the problem that I had and that of my friends, was that people equated freedom and capitalism, basically, and that was kind of the message that we got from the people coming over. I mean, there was the welcome money that the German government dished out, and there were the lines at Hertie, and and everything was about like material gain, which was not. I mean, we living in the West had no real interest in this. We weren't, there was no libidinal cathexis on fridges or something, at least not in where I grew up. So I say, I mean, that's the part that I remember, that Gysi kind of opened this up as a more concrete way of saying that. There were other, there were others who kind of articulated a vision for Germany, that integrated some of the maybe idealistic or illusionary elements that people associated with life in East Germany.
Yes, please.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Ellie Nawaki and I'm from Indiana University, and I was an eyewitness myself, but from a very different perspective. And I want to thank you all. I have so many thoughts that I wrote down. So I was a student in Mabo Gandalan for a year in 84 or 85, 86, and then in 1989 I was a second lieutenant in the United States Army in Bavaria, West Germany. 30 years ago this weekend, I went up to Grafenwehr, which many of you know is the large training area in Bavaria, to pick up a friend of mine who I graduated with from Montana State University. I had a degree in German and history. And I really had no idea what was going on. I had been listening to the radio because I speak and understand pretty good German at the time. And by the end of the weekend, when I took my friend back on the Autobahn, I believe it's 9, Autobahn 9, I saw the Trabants, and I knew that things were changing, had changed. And the mission of my unit, my platoon of artillery pieces, was to basically march towards Weiden in Bavaria, set in place and fire nuclear projectiles at the Soviet forces, tactical nukes, should the Soviets come from Czechoslovakia. My personal experience, having been a student in Marburg, I had never seen anti-American protests coming from a small town in Montana. Eye-opening, and then three years later, experiencing the events of 1989 was absolutely unbelievable. And the one final thing I'll say, because I don't want to take too much time, the one thing that I remember, and it happened in early 1990, I was driving home from work. I lived south of Nuremberg and of Schwabach, which is where the unit was, south of Nuremberg near Weißenburg. And there was a broken down Trabant in a little rest area pull-off. I was in my Army uniform, and there was a family of East Germans. And his hood was up on the car, and I pulled over to help him. And when I got out of my car, he was in shock. And his wife was in shock. They had 2 small children in the back, and I do not know what he thought. But here is an American soldier, U.S. Army, Ellie Nawaki or Nowatzki, and I offered to help him. I spoke German, es ist hier, das Problem, kann ich Ihnen helfen, und so weiter, und so weiter. And he refused. But then a thought occurred to me. I bought some Reese's peanut butter cups at the local base before I left. I went back to my car. I got the Reese's peanut butter cups, and I took the chocolate to his spouse and said, "This is American chocolate. It's very famous, Reese's peanut butter cups. It's for your children." And thank you very much. And I said, "Auf Wiedersehen," and that was amazing. Very briefly, speeding forward, I was part of the NATO certification exercise for Poland in 1997 in Celle, Germany. And then in 2000 to 2002, I participated in the first joint U.S.-Polish exercises in Drawsko-Pomorski, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And it's just, I had to pinch myself numerous times how things had changed from 1985, 86 when I was a student to later in my military career. So thank you for letting me share those comments with you.
Elliot, that's a hard act to follow. But I wanted to thank the panel. This is a wonderful way to start the conference, because it occurred to me that when you come from outside, you think of 1989 as a kind of really mythic moment. It's been crystallized, solidified. It has its own rhetorics, its own discourses. It's hard to get beyond its established meaning. And what it seems that we were doing is in some way deconstructing and nuancing, and what do we do as scholars? Complicating all of these things to the real actuality of events behind these kind of mythic representations. And so the question that was asked here about the alternative seems to me a key one. And I wanted to ask about the moment, because it wasn't any any time that in history that this happened, but it was precisely at a moment that in the West marks the triumph of neoliberal capitalism, a certain kind of capitalism, not Sweden, but America and Thatcher's Britain. And I would ask Tomasz this, because we've heard a lot about Germany, but what about a place like Poland? Were there thinkings, as we know there were in Germany, about alternatives, democratic, socialist, or whatever, or had all of that been sort of erased, discredited by this time?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. I mean, as I mentioned, that our society is divided because of the transformation process. Because from some people, this kind of new liberal market is the best solution, and they are a kind of success. I mean, people who get the success because of the transformation process and this kind of new rule of play are the best for them. But on the other hand, we have many people who are, who feel as losers of the transformation process, and that's why political parties are using this kind of divisions in the society, and they are using this kind of language because they know, because of the surveys, I mean public opinions and so on, and they know that there are many people who are looking for this kind of, let's say, support from the state, or just based on their experience in communism time, they are looking for this kind of support from the state. So it means that this kind of new liberal market, liberal economy is for them nothing good. And what is really important to understand the situation, current situation in Poland, so we should remember that before the Second World War, Polish society was divided between different classes, I mean upper class and middle class and so on. But during the communism time, I mean the public education and so on changed the whole situation. And it means that the society was like equal, not like Szlachta and other parts of society, but as an equal society. So right now, because of the liberal market, many people gain a lot of money and they became rich people and so on. But at the same time, a lot of people they perceive themselves as a losers, or that something went in the wrong way. So that's why this situation is complicated to understand, and politicians they know that they have to use this kind of language to describe this kind of divisions, and that's why they are using this situation as a tool for the political struggle right now. Thank you.
Maurizio, did you have
I maybe just want to say the word, the name of the country, because later today we have a fantastic speaker who's going to speak about Yugoslavia. But in terms of openness to alternative ideas or expecting radical changes in 1989, I would argue from the outside, no one suspected that Yugoslavia was going to disintegrate in the mid-80s, or anyway, it's another story. But Yugoslavia was also among the so-called non-aligned countries and had a leadership kind of role in, and that kind of just no one remembers or knows, or so that also was part of maybe the end of the possibility, and the kind of neoliberalism becoming even more normative in other parts of the world, Central Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Please start.
So I was finished my dissertation in 1989 and came back to the United States to defend to Harvard and missed the conference, interestingly, that you talked about. I have no memory of it. But it says something about the disciplines and their relationship with each other, and these elites, academic elites or elites at the knowledge level and political elites. I think we would have to distinguish between them in talking about our failure to anticipate. Because in one sense, of course, the idea that this would last forever is kind of silly. Nothing does, right? But it was very uncomfortable to think this, and it's difficult to think unsettling thoughts. And why was this so difficult to think through? It's not like the thought wasn't there, but to think it was almost like a repression, certainly among the political elites. We find the same thing with climate change, in especially the United States, where political elites are totally incapable of thinking through this, although it's obvious that it's a thought. So, but for myself, I was studying the construction of the vision, which of course entailed the idea that this is constructed, and therefore it can be constructed in alternative ways, and that's what I was interested in. What were the grounds for the distinction between the two peoples? And just to say that question had no resonance among the political science people. It's just not a question. Why one would study that, there was division, and that's it. And then how do we deal with division, but no idea of it having any human factor, like there are alternatives that could be constructed in different ways and whatnot. Although that's obviously a thought that was there too. There were openings politically, rapprochement, through coming close, annäherung. So there were ways in which these thoughts were there, but there was no ability to think through these. And I think that parallel, the question to today, is absolutely there, where we perhaps live through a momentous moment, and the different kind of elites are unable to think through this. Now, does that mean that non-elites can think through this? That's not their job. But perhaps in their practice you will see things falling apart, which is certainly what I saw. But not necessarily that they can think through these alternatives.
I'd like to say something, if I could, very quickly about that. I'm glad that Shepherd reminded me of our meeting in Harvard with all these experts on East Germany. And where are you? Oh, there you are. And, as a foremost expert on Poland, you're undoubtedly cringing and thinking, oh, God, these people are so not with it. I was in, but it has to do in part with the fragmentation of academics. So you have people who are working on Poland, people who are working on East Germany. So I was in Hong Kong a few months ago and had an exchange, public exchange with the Consul General, who had been in Poland on June 4th, 1989, and I was in East Germany on June 4th, 1989. And one of the themes that came up was that everybody remembers the event on June 4th, 1989 in China, which was the Tiananmen Square massacre. What people, it's amazing, don't concentrate on is the fact that this was also the date of the first semi-free elections in the entire Soviet bloc in Poland, which were eclipsed by this other event. And so you can't understand what happened in Eastern Europe without going back to that point, even though there was enormous suspicion of Poland, and had been for a long time in East Germany. Nobody in East Germany raised the issue of Poland to me at that time, not a single person. Finally, a comment on academics. One thing I learned in this period was that I had completely underestimated the role of individuals and of leadership in history. Political scientists, they used to hate the idea of leadership studies. Now they treat it as totally irrelevant, not serious. And so coming back to our ability to think of alternatives, man, this was also about individual leaders and their courage.
Yes, thank you all for that interesting panel. I would like to bring the Italian case together with the German case, because I think what you have been telling us about the reframing of refugees from Albania happened in Germany as well in the year after 89 and so until 92, I would say, that there was a very welcoming mood towards the East Germans, but then this changed very fast, and I would be interested if Jim and Martin would agree with that, but it was like what the trope today, what we hear, the second-class citizen, the Eastern German, as a self-perception, started already in 91 or 92, I would say, with the downfall of communism as, yes, let's welcome those poor refugees from the communist era and bring it together as one German nation, and then they became like seen as almost like migrants today. There's a discussion going on in Germany in the last 2 years whether East Germans and migrants should team up for their interests, because in a way they have the same position in society. So I would be interested if Jim and Martin would agree with that reframing.
Well, I spoke not too much, but very quickly. What's fascinating to me about this is the way that 1989 has been reframed by the right, and particularly by, I'm working on this now, what I call right-wing Leninists, intellectuals. And so now in campaign speeches in East Germany, the theme is that East Germany's been betrayed, and therefore the true representation of Es sind das Volk, we are the people, is to allow the East Germans to stand up against the scourge of, among other things, migrants and betraying CDU politicians.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that a lot of factors contributed, but the whole Abwicklung, for example, of businesses and universities, West Germany's patronizing attitude towards East Germans. I mean, it became very clear that people were seen, or East Germans were seen as second-class citizens. I mean, the differential in salaries also after reunification, that all played an important role. There was obviously migration also from, less structured regions like Pomerania, or where you feel okay. Very quickly there were these villages where there were only old people left, and I think that also contributed to this perception, basically, that there was migration to the West. So yes, I mean, I would agree. I know there's a discussion in Germany about this kind of migrant status of East Germans. I mean, I'd like to hear more about it. I haven't really followed it that much, but it's certainly kind of a conceptual framework that is very interesting and should be considered.
This has been fascinating, and one of the things that strikes me is that we've spent some time thinking about ourselves, reflecting on how academics have a certain myopia or a certain limitation in willingness or ability to see things. When I apply that to my own field, or our own field of German and cultural studies, German literature in particular, I remember a time, and Martin, I think you referenced this also, when it was really typical for most of our professors to speak about East Germany as the better Germany. At least in a certain ideal sense, not ironically. There were some exceptions, of course, but it was kind of held up, as you said, as a more humane society. Now, you qualified that with, we naively thought that, because one has to say that nowadays, right? But then the next sentence was right away, but serious intellectuals were also selling us this vision. So I'm wondering to what extent we need to come to terms with that. I really appreciated the nuanced version you gave. The West was not this, bastion of freedom that it has come to be in the very reductive narratives in the post-war period. Neither was the East this bessere Deutschland, the better Germany, in an unqualified sense. But I'm just wondering about the kind of simplistic reassessment in the last 30 years. And what occurred to me, what might be a helpful way to think about it is this: go back to the Möglichkeitssinn that Mark talked about with Maurizio, that special time that you moved in January 1990, before the so-called Anschluss, before East Germany gets annexed, if you will, into West Germany. That time of great possibility. It's interesting that intellectuals, I think, to a T, have no trouble crediting that period with all kinds of positive, potentially good ideas. Bola, I was mentioning Georgisi, et cetera. You mentioned some interesting ideas about kind of modified capitalism, all kinds of progressive ideas that would have indeed been a third way. We have no trouble identifying that and saying those were potentially at least good things. They grew out of largely East Germany. When we look at that special time period, we don't have to begin to say, oh my God, but the police state, but all the bad things. We can still see it as a source for good ideas. But take that away, move beyond, and then suddenly we're hamstrung, or whatever the phrase is, we're hard put to see clearly whether we were completely naive in the old days in thinking that that East Germany or Eastern Europe, more broadly speaking, was in some way a bastion of great ideals. I still think, this is obviously what we're going to be talking about in the next panel, but those, are we really, if we're going to talk about our honesty and what we saw clearly 30 years ago, are we all really going to renounce all that?
Very quickly, these were among the best periods of my life. And I'm well aware of the police state aspects because I've gotten a lot of nice photos of myself recently with people following me. They tormented my wife and all of that. But the ability in East Germany, but all of these countries, to get together with people over a dinner table and talk about, history, humanity, Liebknecht, whatever, was so wonderful and magical. And you couldn't have serious discussions like that in West Germany. And academic discussions here in West Germany were very forced and artificial. I would say particularly in West Germany. It was very difficult to have serious discussions about East Germany. So among the most wonderful times of my life.
I think, East Germany was a leader in culture, and that was contributed to kind of the perception of intellectuals and academics. I mean, the whole Gustav Wolff debate after the fall of the wall was kind of an example of that, in my opinion, of perhaps the, I would call it in air quotes remorse that Western intellectuals felt having bought into that idea of what Jim just said. First of all, I want to say, what he said earlier, how in his presentation and everything, it was fascinating for me to listen to these very detailed memories of encounters with very important people in East Germany. And I think, to me, that's a part that's really missing in the narrative. Talking about Schabowski's personality or what he saw 7 days before the wall fell. And I think this type of very strong focus on very particular moments during that time. Somebody needs to narrate that in some way, or maybe has perhaps already, because I think that's where these visions are. They're not in some larger imagination, they're in those moments, in the 2 weeks after the wall fell, in conversations with very particular people who tried to articulate what they thought the future would hold.
I think we might have time for one more brief question. Anybody would like to check off?
Could I have a brief comment on this is fascinating panel and a great discussion trying to think back about really fundamental issues. Let me say two things. Now, first of all, I think that we really need to realize that pre-89 Eastern Europe was a set of parallel universe. The differences between Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Hungary were immense. I think it's not only in this kind of, there was this very funny joke about two dogs meeting on the Polish border. One dog is going from Czechoslovakia to Poland, and another dog is going from Poland to Czechoslovakia. And the Polish dog says to Czech dog, "Are you crazy? Why are you going to Poland? There is terrible economic situation, nothing to eat, and so on." And the Czech dog says, "Well, but I can bark, right?" So, the point is that, there is this notion of revolution without ideas, which happened in 1989. But I think, the East Germans and Czechs were living, in memories of '68. Socialism with the human face. That was the idea which animated, a lot of intellectual debates in the 1980s. Now, Poles dealt with this in the 1970s. With the Committee of Worker Defense emerging in Poland in the 1970s, the idea of socialism with human face was all over, right? This was it. It should never happen. This is not a way to go. So the whole notion on human rights, the whole notion of liberal ideas with Kagel and then, with a lot of intellectuals in Poland, in order to understand those reaction after '89, we really need to step back and see what were the trajectories of these different countries leading to 1989. Poles in the 1980s didn't care about Gorbachev. It was non-existing, story. No one really paid any attention to what was going on in the official circles in the Soviet Union. Now, in Czechoslovakia and East Germany, this was like a key issue, right? So, that's another example how different those countries were. How that contributed to the idea of the revolution without ideas. I think that there was a lot of ideas in '89 revolution, but these were not the ideas the left-wing intellectuals were hoping for before '89, and I think that's probably is part of the confusion.
Well, thank you to all of our panel participants and to everyone who joined the discussion. And now we'll adjourn for some light refreshments in the atrium. Otherwise, thank you so much.